So my name's Katrina Fox, and I'm going to begin by telling a story, because my talk is about the importance of storytelling in animal rights activism. So when I was a child, when I was growing up, my best friend was my cat, Kitty. My dad brought him home. He was a little feral kitten. My dad worked as a painter and decorator at the local psychiatric institution. And this feral cat had given birth to some kittens, and my dad brought one home for us. And Kitty was a little spitfire to begin with, he was all like, but eventually, I gave him lots of love and I had a few scratches, but ultimately we got a really lovely bond going, and he became my best friend. Now, it's not that I didn't have other children as friends, but you know how sometimes children, they're very, they're not very consistent. So one minute they're going to be, they're all happy, clappy with you, all friendly, and the next minute they all gang up together and they come up to you and they go, "We're not your friend." And you're just left feeling, really horrible and hurt and rejected. Whereas Kitty, there was none of that with Kitty. Yes, Kitty would do the things that cats do and sometimes get a bit arsey, if you'd gone off and left him for a few hours, but very easily forgive. So really from Kitty, I got unconditional love and acceptance. Now, on the 28th of April, 1982, when I was 16, this is me at 16 with Kitty, I went out on my first ever date with a boy. It was my cousin Alan. I'd met him I know, that's a bit weird, isn't it? I met him a few days ago at a family wedding, and he asked me out on a date. And I said yes, and I bragged about it to my school friends. I said, "Oh, I've got a boyfriend. I'm going out on a date." And one of the reasons I did that was because I wasn't actually really into boys at the time, and still not actually. I thought, well, I didn't want anyone to know that, so it was kind of my secret. I had crushes on Joan Collins and Elizabeth Taylor and my female teachers at school, and I kind of knew that I was a lesbian at the time, but I didn't want anyone else to know. So I, told all my school friends, "I've got a boyfriend, I'm going out with Alan." And he took me down to the local CB club, and I don't know if there's anyone here old enough to remember CB radios, but it was a big thing around about the 80s. And we went to on this date. It was nothing special, he was a nice enough guy. Anyway, he walked me home, and I lived in a council flat in Dartford, which is just outside of South London. And there's an area, we called it the shelter, where you go in and there's like a little area where you can kind of hang out, and then you can go up the stairs to the flats. And Alan walked me home, and then we got into the shelter, and he kissed me. Tongue kissing, like, and I know, it was a bit kind of ill. It was my first kiss, my first date, first kiss with a boy, and, it really wasn't that special. But then as I was kissing Alan, I saw out of the corner of my eye Kitty sitting on the steps, looking with his head tilted as if to say, "What are you doing?" And I instantly just felt this awful bit of guilt. I thought, oh my God, Kitty's watching me kiss this boy. He must think I don't love him anymore. And the next day I dumped Alan. I rang the poor guy up and I said, I didn't say why, because I think my cat might be jealous, because I thought that might be a little bit strange. But I said to him, I'm not ready for a relationship, blah, blah, blah. And, poor guy, he said, "Oh, that's a hat trick of me being dumped. You're the third girl in a row to, dump me." And I felt a little bit guilty, but, my loyalties were with Kitty because, he was my best friend. Now, I don't know if Kitty was channeling some kind of Persian cat goddess that was wanting to, get the message through to me to be yourself, to not be afraid of who you are. You don't have to conform and be like everybody else. It's okay to be you. I don't know if that was Kitty or whether it was simply my intuition and Kitty was some kind of physical manifestation of that message. But I'm very grateful because I wouldn't be here today with my lovely wife at the background and here talking to you lovely people this morning. So I just want to check in with you. What are you feeling and thinking right now? And you can be perfectly honest after I've told you that story.
I completely relate.
Completely relate.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. What else? Yeah.
I think just thinking about how animals have impacted me and stories behind, certain things that have happened in my life through animals kind of thing, how many stories there are really in my life about animals.
Wonderful. That's really good. That's really lovely. Anyone else? And if you're thinking, God, she's weird, that's okay. That's okay too. Yes?
Animals are part of your family.
Animals are part of my family, absolutely. Yes?
I'm confused because I came in
Like, so.
Ah. Yeah, that's great. I like that. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. Nice. Yes.
Just general amusement.
General amusement. Awesome. So the point about that is, I told a story and it engaged you in different ways. So for some of you said you relate. Animals are part of the family. It told you something about me, perhaps about yourself, how animals are your family. So the point is that stories engage us. They engage us on so many levels. They engage us in our mind, our emotions, our spirit, and our values. So unlike facts and figures, which can be a bit dry, and we kind of get a bit logical and we can think about it, they don't impact us in a way that stories do on an emotional level. And the beauty about stories is we're hardwired to hear them or watch them or read them. We can't help it. When someone starts to tell a story, providing it's an engaging story, we want to know what happens next. We want to know why it's important. How does it relate to us? So stories are incredibly powerful. And so today I'm going to share with you some examples of how you can use story in animal rights activism, and also show you some examples of how stories have been used really successfully. Okay. So when I talked about stories pique our curiosity, and if you're on social media, particularly Facebook, you'll have probably seen a spate of posts that start off with a pretty bland first sentence, although this one's not that bland. Man tries to hug a wild lion, but it could be anything from, woman walks down Glebe Point Road, but then the next sentence is, you won't believe what happened next. It piques our curiosity, even against our better judgment. We often will click through. I've done that on Facebook, where I know it's called clickbait, and it's a tactic that these websites like Reshareable, Upworthy, BuzzFeed, it's a tactic that they use to get you to click through, because they're essentially storytelling sites. Now, the quality of the stories are pretty mixed, but nevertheless, they're storytelling sites, and they're piquing our curiosity. It's like when you're talking one-to-one on someone, you're like, oh my God, you never guess what happened to me the other day. You automatically want to go, what did happen to you the other day? So we're hardwired for stories. So I really want to get that point across, that stories are so powerful. Sometimes we can get a bit caught up with the statistics in animal rights activism, and talking about numbers and facts and figures, which is good in one sense, but when you can put that within a story, it's going to really, really engage people and affect them at much deeper levels. And the beauty of stories is, of course, they can be shared anywhere. We can share stories one-on-one with our friends, our family. We can share them in groups. We can share them on social media. And of course, we can share them in traditional media as well. So as some of you may know, I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist for 15 years. I've worked on a whole range of publications, from human resources, social housing, building and construction, advertising and media, and a whole range of others in between. I've written several articles on animal advocacy and veganism for Sydney Morning Herald, ABC, News Limited. So stories are my business. Stories are journalist business. That's what we want. The media is into stories. And so when you can craft a story to get an animal rights message across, you're far more likely to get coverage rather than just, this is happening, you should write about it because it's terrible. We need to be able to craft some kind of story around it to sell it to journalists, as well as other people. So stories you can do various things with stories. Stories you can use to shock, to entertain, inspire, uplift, and move. And I think that last one's really important. We want to move people. And within animal rights activism, we want to move people to take some kind of action. Now that could be signing a petition. It could be writing a letter to your MP. It could be changing their thinking so fundamentally that they choose to go vegan, changing their lifestyle. But ultimately, we want to be able to move people to take an action, and stories are an amazing and powerful way to do that. So this is a screen grab. It's not terribly good quality. I grabbed it off of YouTube, but this is a really good example of, this is my friend Karen Dawn in the US. Some of you might have heard of her. She's quite a well-known animal activist, author of Thanking the Monkey. She runs a service called Dawn Watch, and what she does is she's got a load of subscribers, like activists such as ourselves, and whenever the media, particularly mainstream media, runs a positive story or some kind of good coverage on animal rights or animal welfare, animal rights, she emails her subscribers and says, hey, the New York Times has run this. Yeah, write a letter to the editor or to the journalist to say thank you for doing this, because what that does is it encourages the media to then keep writing these kind of articles, because they say, oh, there's a big interest in this. Now, every year, Karen adopts 2 turkeys around Thanksgiving time, and she keeps them at her house in LA for a few months, and then they go off to live at a sanctuary. And then she contacts the media, and every year she gets mainstream media, TV coverage, where the TV crew come along and they film the turkeys and they film the Thanksgiving party. Now, I was actually at this one. You might see me at the top left there. I was staying with Karen, and the ABC and the US came round and they shot some footage of the party. But what's so important is that they also used some footage and imagery that Karen herself had created. This is Karen blow drying one of the turkeys. So when she gets them, they're usually quite dirty because they've come from factory farms. They're in a bit of a state, so she gently bathes them and she blow dries them. So this footage was included in the ABC's media coverage. And there was also some footage that Karen showed that showed the horrors of factory farming of the turkeys. So it was basically a feel-good story. The whole story was, look, turkeys are not on the table of this Thanksgiving, they're actually at the party. So it was a happy story, a feel-good story, but interspersed with that was some examples of the horrors of, these turkeys are the exception. Some horrible stuff generally happens to most turkeys. So what I want to get the point across with that is that nowadays there are far more opportunities for all of us to be able to get our photographs, our footage and our stories into the media, including mainstream media. Because they're so hungry for content now, it's 24/7, everything's online, even radio shows, they've got an online presence. Whereas before, it would be unheard of really for, something like the New York Times or the ABC in the US to use video footage or photos taken by, a consumer, like a regular Josephine public. They would send out, a staff photographer, or they'll send out their TV crews. Now, even though they sent out the crew to film at the party, they didn't have to pay for factory farm footage, from Getty Images or any of those places. They didn't have to pay for, they wouldn't have been able to pay for a photo of this, because this, was taken by one of Karen's friends, so they're willing and able to take your footage and your videos. So do make sure that, if you're visiting an animal sanctuary or whatever you're doing, you've got your own animals, take video footage, take photos of them, even on your iPhones or that wasn't the plug for Apple, any mobile phone or tablet. Just, take those photos, because you never know when you may be able to use them. And of course you can use them on your own social media as well, because nowadays everyone's a publisher, okay? And yeah, the media like lifestyle stories, where we love happy animal stories, and they're more resistant to systemic animal exploitation and cruelty stories. I was talking to a publicist in the US, Kezia Joran from Evolutus PR. I'm interviewing a whole bunch of people for a book I'm doing on how to start and grow a successful vegan business. And I was talking to her as a PR person, and she was saying this is certainly true, particularly in the US, and I think it's also true here in Australia to an extent. It doesn't mean we can't get those hard-hitting stories covered, but a lot of the time we can get our message through these more kind of positive and uplifting stories. So here's another example of beautiful use of story to get an animal rights message across. Edgar's Mission, a lot of you will probably know Edgar's Mission. Pam Ahern and her team do a wonderful job of what I just mentioned, taking photographs, taking footage of particular animals, and then they get a lot of regular mainstream media coverage. So this is Frosty the snow goat. Some of you might have heard his story. Little Frosty was a baby goat, and he was born very, very sick, had all sorts of things wrong with him, to the point where he couldn't use his back legs. And with a lot of tender love and care from Pam and her team, they made him this contraption so that he could walk, to build up the strength in his legs. And his story went viral. It didn't just go national, it actually went international, because basically the story was resilience. This little goat was teaching people how to be resilient. But by telling that as well, it's also showing a goat, which is traditionally thought of, as an animal to be used and exploited, is changing the narrative on that. It's like, oh look, little goat, persistent and resilient and strong. Now, sadly, Frosty did die eventually. His little body was just so sick that it gave out, but not before his story had gone international, gone viral, and changed the narrative around this particular farmed animal. You can see him there playing with his friend, little sweetie. Again, this is another one from Edgar's Mission. You might recognise Polly Pig. Polly's a huge ambassador for human rights, for animal rights, but for human compassion, I think, as well. When Pam tells the story, she takes Polly around to schools, so again, it's changing that narrative around farmed animals. It's introducing Polly to children, and they're not thinking of them as bacon. That by telling the story of Polly, it changes people's perceptions of how they think about, in this case, pigs and other farmed animals. And Timmy the sheep is another one that's a good ambassador. So there's a really great example of, if you live with animals, to tell their stories, not just to the media, but also just to your friends and to your family. And I want to talk a little bit about the power of positivity. I know as animal activists, sometimes we get very, very angry, and we sometimes get into despair and depression and rage because there is just, so much, horrific stuff that's going on. It just seems relentless and never-ending. And sometimes, we can be a bit snappy and a bit grumpy and do the angry vegan thing. But I do just want to kind of point out the power of positivity. If we take this, for example, and how we can use story to get our points across in a way that people engage with us. So, sometimes, I don't know if any of you have been sitting around a dinner table and you're all sitting around eating, and of course you get your vegan option, and the person sitting next to you, they're tucking into their steak and chips, whatever, and they look at you and go, oh, you're vegan. Oh, how come you're vegan? And I know how utterly tempting it is to say, well, why aren't you vegan? Isn't that the real question? It's so tempting. I know I've kind of been there and wanted to do it. But I'm going to suggest to you that by doing that, we put the person, even further away from us, and even further away from our message of animal rights activism. So, and I have done this myself. I'm in no way standing up here as some kind of paragon of vegan virtue. But what I'm going to suggest is, so for example, if someone said that to me nowadays, I might do this instead, and tell them my story of becoming vegan. So I might kind of say, well, you know what? When I was 11, I asked my mum what the beef burger was made of that was on my plate that we've been eating. And she told me it was from a cow. I said, no, I had no idea. I said, I know it sounds silly, but I really had no idea. And every summer, although I'm a city girl, I used to go and stay with my Uncle Dan and my cousin Lucy in the country. And I'd see these beautiful cows, with their babies, and, I'd look into their eyes and I'd feed them an apple, and they're just such beautiful creatures. So I was just really upset when I realised that. So I became vegetarian very early, even though I didn't know what the word meant. And then in the mid-90s, I was on a coach trip to Oxford in the UK, and there was a woman next to me, and I got my lunch out, and she said, oh, what are you eating? And I said, oh, it's a Marmite and cheese sandwich. Marmite's the British equivalent of Vegemite. And it turns out, and I said, oh, would you like one? And she said, no, I'm vegan. I said, what's that? And she explained, and I said, oh, the cheese is actually vegetarian cheese. I was like, proud. And then she explained to me about the dairy industry, and that babies, cows, are taken away from their mothers, they're artificially inseminated. And I didn't know all that, I just kind of thought, happy cows, they don't die, they give their milk willingly. And when I found that out, I sort of did a bit more research, and I thought, wow, isn't it strange that we don't know this? Notice the use of the word we. I said, we don't know this stuff, we're not told this stuff, it's hidden from us. So when I found that out, I decided to embrace a vegan lifestyle, and I was amazed at how wonderful it is and how easy it is to use veganism. How do you think they're going to feel, right, as compared to me going, well, why are you not vegan? How they're going to react to that, and instead how they might react to the story that I've just told. Now, they might still think, I'm a bit of a weirdo, but if they're then, going to work the next day, far rather their conversation be, oh, I had dinner last night, there was a vegan at the dinner table, and she told me this, and this. Better that they do that it stimulates their thinking, rather than, oh my God, I sat next to one of this vegan, oh my God, they're bloody extreme, and oh my God, she was awful. Do you see what I mean? So we can actually use our own story to communicate with other people in a way that is a benefit for the animals. Does that make sense? Cool. Now, on the other hand, I'm not saying we should all be happy, clappy, yay, everything's fantastic all the time. There's a time and a place for doing some of the hard-hitting stuff. And this is one example here. So some of you might have seen this ad. Is the party really worth it? Horseracingkills.com. This was the Coalition for the Protection of Racehorses. They got this billboard up in Melbourne, a huge billboard, and of course it was really controversial, and it got taken down after a couple of days. But this is a really great example of using imagery to tell a story. So this is telling the story of horse racing, the behind the scenes of what happens in the horse racing. And it gets people thinking, they're gearing up for the Melbourne Cup. The narrative, the story around the Melbourne Cup is, oh, it's all glamorous, we're all going to frock up and be fabulous and celebrate and have time off work, and we put bets on. And this changes that up instantly. The use of the image, the text, it says, well, hang on, and it makes people think. So the use of the question is really good as well, because it's like, oh, what's this? And you've got the website there very prominently so people can go and find out more. This is Tommy. I'm not sure whether you can see that terribly well with the light, but that's Tommy. Some of you will remember Animals Australia's campaign against live export. And I mentioned earlier about how when we're talking about facts and figures, it doesn't really engage people on an emotional level. Also, when we're using large numbers and statistics, then again, we don't engage, we disassociate. When we start talking about hundreds or thousands or millions or billions, we can disassociate. So when we hear that, millions of animals, or even humans as well, if we hear that, thousands of children die of starvation each year, we might have an initial visceral reaction of, oh my God, that's a lot. But that's about it, you know what I mean? We can too easily disassociate. But when you tell the story of one being, one individual, that becomes really powerful. So this was Tommy, so he's got a name, and this is what's happened to him. And I mean, I don't know about you, for any of you that saw that footage or, even just read about Tommy's story. I mean, even when I was preparing this PowerPoint, it still gets me. I still feel like, I just want to cry, because it's telling that story of one person. We relate. We can relate far more to the story of one individual. So this was a very clever way of doing that. And by telling the story of one, you are telling the story of many. By telling Tommy's story, we told the story, Animals Australia told the story of thousands and millions of these cattle that suffer horrendously. So really focus on and have a think about how you can tell the story of individual animals. And the beautiful thing is that the animals, or the beings, the individuals, don't even have to be real. This is an animated pig. So some of you will remember that, again, this is an Animals Australia campaign, the Make It Possible. This is a campaign against factory farming. So this is an animated pig, and again, this was very clever storytelling because it also employed the use of music, a very popular song, Someday. And here was this animated pig, talking about someday, I'll be free, and then juxtaposed with horrible actual factory farm footage of what goes on with these pigs. I mean, I don't know anybody that didn't cry well, maybe not people who worked in the meat industry, but, a lot of people were really impacted. Even people that eat meat, that like their bacon, were crying at this. So this is a very clever way of using stories in a way that's not even telling a story of a real person. So you can use animation. Those of you here who are creative, think creatively about how you can tell the stories. Now, there are different ways. Like last night, some of you might have seen Lucent, the documentary on what the horrible things that go on in Australian pig factories. And documentary, again, beautiful way of telling stories. This was just another way, and I think as activists we have to be creative so that we're not just following one formula of, okay, this is what's going on, it's awful, here's the facts, here's the figures, we must do something about it. That's great, but we must also think how can we be more creative, whether it's a billboard, whether it's an animated story, and using a popular song to touch people's hearts, minds, values. So I really want you to invite you to collect and share stories wherever you can. And you don't have, they can be your stories, they can be the stories of your animals, stories of animals that you meet, but also other people. So don't be afraid to share other people's stories. This is Celia Hammond. I don't know if anybody of you knows Celia Hammond, but in the 1960s in the UK, she's British, she was a very, very famous supermodel before the term was even coined. She was photographed by David Bailey and all the major photographers. That's a cover of one of many Vogues that she was on. And then Celia had, and she was wearing fur and everything, it was the 60s, she was into that high glam, etc. And then she had an epiphany. And she basically gave all that up. She gave up all this glamorous lifestyle and to rescue cats. And you'll see on this side, you can see her with a couple of cats. And what she did was she opened the Celia Hammond Animal Trust. She had a sanctuary in Sussex in the UK, in the countryside, which she ran with Carla Lane, who was quite a well-known British TV scriptwriter. But in the East End, in the southeast of London, she set up a clinic, a low-cost de-sexing clinic for cats, and it was also a cat rescue. And what Celia would do, so she went from this real kind of glamorous high life to literally getting hardly any sleep, because she would be at the clinic during the day. In the evening, she would then go out with another member of the clinic, and they would go out and they would trap feral cats that lived in the area, bring them back, de-sex them, and then either rehome any of them that were not overly feral, or release them back, but at least they weren't continuing to reproduce. And this was in an area, Lewisham. I did some voluntary work there a couple of times a week, and it was in an area where people couldn't really afford high veterinary care, and this was her way of doing activism, and she barely got any sleep. Sometimes I'd go in there of an evening to feed the cats. I was one of the feeders for a while. Celia would be clapped out on an armchair, fast asleep. So that was a real kind of change, and of course she got a lot of media for this because it was such a change. So that was her way of doing activism. So that's you can share other people's stories. Dan Matthews, Dan's speaking I think 12:30 today via Skype. So Dan's the VP of PETA in the US. I really like his story of how he got into activism, animal rights activism. So he was growing up, he was a gay man, and he went fishing with his father, and when his father caught the fish, and the fish was thrown down on the deck of the boat, and it was struggling and struggling, Dan related to his experiences of being bullied, because at school, he was beaten up and bullied for being gay, and he made that connection. So again, that's something that you can share with other people. So think about other people's stories that you can share, because sometimes that can even have the benefit of not being quite so confrontational. It's a bit like when I said about, well, why are you vegan kind of thing. You can obviously share your own story, but then you could also maybe share your story of, say your mum's gone vegan and she's in her 60s. You could maybe explain that, just share her story, particularly if the person you're sharing it with is of that age. And it just becomes, less confrontational in a way that you can share. So that's really kind of the power of stories. This is Jeanette and Alan Murray-Wakelin. So my partner Tracy, who's at the back there, she's a clinical hypnotherapist and naturopath. So she has people come into her clinic, and often there's things wrong with them, particularly often physically. She'll move them onto a plant-based eating. And she shares the stories of people, particularly older people, if she's got an older client, who have been living, plant-based eating, plant-based lifestyle for some time. And what that does is, it lowers people's barriers, by telling them, okay, right, this is what you've got to start eating. Sometimes they're a bit like, oh my God, what, I've got to give up my steak, I can't eat cheese. And they get a bit freaked out by it. Whereas when they then share, when the story, where Tracy shares the stories, it actually uplifts and inspires them. So they'll come out, because I work part-time with Tracy, so they'll come out of her clinic room and they'll into reception, she'll say, come and have a seat. And she sits them down in front of her computer and she pulls up a video of Jeanette and Alan, who ran around Australia 366 consecutive days, ran a marathon every day on a raw food vegan diet. And both in their 60s, and Jeanette is a survivor of breast cancer. So basically what that's saying is, you think you can't give up your meat, come on, right? So you see how you can use stories to move people in a way that really not only lowers their barriers, but in this instance actually inspires them. Because I sit there and you literally see the people, they watch this video, they learn about this story, and they're kind of like, wow, it just completely shifts their thinking and their mind, so that they then leave going, right, I can do this. And that's good for them, it's good for animals, and it's good for the planet. So yes, we need to be creative. As animal activists, we can't get stuck and mired in one way of sharing what's going on in the world today in regards to animals. As I mentioned at the beginning, there is so much awful atrocities that are going on in every area, whether it's animals for food, for entertainment. There's so much, and we have to be as creative as we possibly can. I know sometimes, particularly when it comes to the media, like I mentioned earlier, the media is far more interested in kind of happy, kind of positive animal type stories. And some people might go, well, that's, the state of journalism, it's appalling, it's gone down. And I agree. I've been in the industry for 15 years and I agree. But, it's tempting to kind of go, well, they should be covering this, they should be covering that. That's all great, but that's not really helping the animals. So I think it's important for us to go, okay, we might think this is a bit tacky, it's a bit fluffy, it's a bit light and fluffy, but if it gets one person to shift their mindset, to shift their attitude towards animals and our treatment of them and how we relate to them, I think it's worth doing. So, and I know there's a lot of vegan creatives. On Facebook, there's a new group been formed. Someone's for vegan film, TV, creative people, and loads of people have joined. So I think that's actually really inspiring, because we can use our creativity to create stories and change the narrative around animals. Some of you might have seen the film The Ghosts in Our Machine that Sydney Vegan Club screened recently. And this was a photographer, Joanne MacArthur. So she's a photographer, and she took photos of some of the horrible stuff that goes on in fur farms and factory farms. She also took beautiful photos of rescued animals in sanctuaries. And so she's used her photography to share the stories of animals. And to change that mindset. So I really just want to invite you to be creative.